The FBI is investigating a wide-scale money laundering operation suspected of cleansing billions of dollars in illicit profits through a major U.S. bank. And what makes this case unusual is the alleged source of the money, Russia and its notorious mob. CBS News correspondent Jim Stewart reports.
Western lawmen have long suspected that when the old Soviet army rolled out of Eastern Europe a decade ago, not all of their tanks and weapons went with them. Some of the gear investigators believe was sold instead to middlemen who then made a fortune peddling it to places like Iraq and Iran. The suspicions, it seems, were well-founded. Today, one of those suspected Russian middlemen, Semion Mogilevich, emerged at the center of an alleged money laundering scheme that now threatens a major U.S. bank. A New York Times report said as much as $10 billion in Russian mob money may have been washed through the Bank of New York in recent months. In a statement, the bank acknowledged it is cooperating in the investigation of the use of the bank to transfer funds from Russia, but pointed out there are no allegations of wrongdoing by the Bank of New York. In a country increasingly rocked by mob violence, federal and international investigators say Mogilevich and his gang stand out.
They tend to be brutal. They have no qualms about that. They like to make examples.
One report credited by lawmen says Mogilevich employed Russian veterans who became infamous for their torture of extortion victims. Other reports link him to ongoing efforts to sell off part of Russia's aging nuclear arsenal.
Certainly the nuclear program in Iran wouldn't even exist, not nearly at the level it is, without the Russian assistance. It's out there.
What bothers federal lawmen the most about this case is the sheer scope of it all. In one 6-month period, the bank was reportedly flooded with 10,000 Russian mob transactions, totaling more than $4 billion, and apparently they had a great deal more where that came from. Jim Stewart, CBS News, Washington.
The Russian story is reported by special correspondent Simon Marks on assignment for the NewsHour.
They are 3 separate corruption scandals that have rocked the Kremlin to its foundations, threatened to engulf President Boris Yeltsin and derail US-Russian relations. All 3 are complex, detailed, and dominated by allegations that are not yet proven facts. With their dizzying array of influential characters, they have created a firestorm. Each scandal centers on money, and each scandal involves alleged dubious business dealings with a wide range of countries worldwide. Scandal number 1 involves the Bank of New York. It hit the headlines a month ago. At its heart, questions about up to $15 billion that reportedly passed through as many as 9 accounts with the bank. The accounts were overseen by 2 Russians, both vice presidents with the bank, one in New York, the other in London. The London employee, Lucy Edwards, who was born Ludmila Pritska, has been fired by the bank and remains behind the closed doors of her apartment in Britain.
We're wondering whether you'd be happy to talk to us about your suspension from the Bank of New York.
I have no comment at this time.
Is there any chance we could film you on the doorstep?
You can talk to my lawyer.
The Bank of New York, which has been cooperating with federal investigators, reportedly opened up to 9 accounts related to a company called Benex. Benex, based in Britain, has only one director and shareholder, a Russian named Peter Berlin. Berlin is married to Lucy Edwards, the bank's fired London employee, and at the bank she helped oversee her husband's accounts. Investigators say the company is also allegedly tied to notorious Ukrainian mobster Semion Mogilevich. Mogilevich denies any connection to prostitution rings, drug sales and other criminal businesses, but underworld activities he allegedly controls throughout the former Soviet bloc are believed by investigators to be responsible for at least some of the money passing through the Benex accounts.
The FBI, I personally, identified Mogilevich as the head of a Eurasian organized crime group operating in the United States as far back as May of 1996.
Jim Moody recently retired as the Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's organized crime program. He was the first U.S. official to identify Mogilevich as a leading member of the East European Mafia.
He and his people conduct the traditional type organized crime activities of extortions and drug trafficking, but he's also into arms trafficking, frauds, and a lot of the extortions they do, I hear, are very brutal. But here you're talking about smart, vicious, organized crime group, and he's supposedly smart and a vicious individual.
And certainly Lucy Edwards, the fired bank employee, knows how criminals often launder their money through banks overseas. In June, she addressed this conference in Latvia. Her subject, money laundering.
We have a very shy audience.
The NewsHour declined to pay the conference organizers the $10,000 asking price for an audio tape of her speech. But even if Mogilevich did have the assistance of bank employees, investigators believe the money he allegedly laundered was only a small portion of the money passing through the Bank of New York. $15 billion is more than 40% of the Russian government's entire annual budget. So investigators have been focusing on the other players in scandal number one. Natasha Kagalovsky, a bank vice president who supervised the Benex accounts, and her husband Konstantin. He is no stranger to the United States. He was once Russia's envoy to the International Monetary Fund, an economic reformer who now says U.S. investigators are using him as a scapegoat in the burgeoning Bank of New York inquiry.
My wife is being accused of being married to a Russian businessman, and that's what all these speculations are based on.
Not so, say those investigating the Bank of New York. They are based instead on concerns that some of the money allegedly laundered through the Benex accounts could have emanated from here, the headquarters of the IMF in Washington, where Mr. Kagalovsky used to work. An internal IMF investigation is underway to determine whether IMF aid to Russia was diverted. The Russians insist it wasn't. Even if the money didn't come directly from the IMF, there are other possible sources, the Russian banks that spectacularly collapsed during the past year. They include a bank called Menatep, which once operated from this cavernous building in Moscow. Menatep's failure was not an ordinary business bankruptcy. It closed after allegedly funneling much of its reserves overseas. Investigators believe it was taking the personal fortunes of Russia's powerful business leaders to havens safe from a free-falling ruble. Among Menatep's executives at the time, Konstantin Kagalovsky, who became the bank's first deputy chairman after leaving the IMF.
The native Russian players in the Bank of New York story, Ms. Kagalovskaya and Ms. Edwards, look like they've been asked to take the fall when we all know they were not freelancing.
Fritz Ermarth was a senior officer with the CIA until his retirement last year. Earlier this year, in an article in the magazine National Interest, he accused U.S. policymakers of consistently ignoring the threat to Russia posed by top-level corruption.
Some portion of the $300 to $500 billion of wealth that have been sucked out of Russia in the last 10 years has come through various pipes, Cyprus, Switzerland, Bahamas, into New York, Bank of New York, among other places. And how much actual money laundering, that is disguising through various transactions, has been going on rather than simply moving and depositing, I have no way of knowing. But this should emphasize the point that it's not just laundering, but capital flight, where the origin of the capital is not really honest and fair.
Not really honest and fair, but not necessarily illegal either. The billions of dollars exiting Russia would, under American law, only be leaving illegally if they could be tied to specific illegal acts. And analysts say the rule of law in Russia is so lax that it may never be possible to tie specific dollars to specific crimes.
Proving that this money was generated dirty is going to be very, very difficult.
So at the end of the day, this could be smoke without fire. This could be activity that's obviously highly suspicious, highly dubious, but might be completely legal.
Based upon Russian law, that's correct. Now, the reason why is because Russian criminal law is woefully inadequate.
The Bank of New York investigation will likely take many months, and without the full cooperation of the Russians, few US observers believe it will ever be possible to untangle completely the trail of money, IMF or otherwise, that passed through the Benex accounts. Without a complete investigation, it may never be known who in Moscow authorized the flight of capital. At the moment, no Kremlin officials are implicated in the Bank of New York scandal. The same cannot be said about scandal number 2. Call it the credit card scandal. Boris Yeltsin is proud of the renovations to the Kremlin that have been carried out during his rule. He's shown them to a stream of visiting foreign leaders in the course of the past few months. But those renovations may have come at an incalculable price. The second scandal dominating Russia centers on claims that in exchange for the renovation contract, a Swiss construction company gave $1 million bribe to the president, members of his family and his senior advisors. Swiss prosecutors say they have evidence showing that the company, Mabetex, deposited money into an account controlled by the Kremlin's chief property manager, Pavel Borodin. It's claimed that credit cards issued to Boris Yeltsin, his daughter Tatiana Dyachenko, and Mr. Borodin were paid off using that money. Last week, in an interview with the NewsHour in his Kremlin office, Mr. Borodin, who has compared the inquiries to the Spanish Inquisition, went to great lengths to proclaim his innocence.
Modern banking technology allows anyone to issue credit cards in any name. Issuing credit cards is one thing, using them is something else. These are my credit cards. Look, you can see them. This one is from Russia's Sberbank. This one is from SBS Agrobank. These are the credit cards I actually use. I can provide you with the receipts. With these cards, I take money from my personal accounts and I pay for business functions and meetings. Everything is transparent. Everything is clear. It is not in my interest to hide anything.
And as for the allegations against President Yeltsin,
I am sure the Yeltsin investigation will soon fall apart. I assure you that Yeltsin is on the state's payroll. He's got no idea what a credit card is all about.
But Swiss prosecutors, according to newspaper reports in Italy, have pointed the finger firmly at Boris Yeltsin and his daughter Tatiana, seen here on the left. One of his key aides, she and her sister, are suspected of using Mabetex-backed credit cards during business trips to Europe. Yuri Skuratov is the Russian prosecutor trying to get to the bottom of the affair. His way has been blocked ever since Boris Yeltsin ordered his dismissal after the public release of a compromising videotape allegedly showing Mr. Skuratov in the company of 2 prostitutes. Just last week, Mr. Skuratov's home was searched again by security agents shortly after he told the NewsHour that 90% of the reports linking the Yeltsin family to the scandal are accurate.
As far as the Yeltsin family is concerned, I am pretty sure that Boris Yeltsin is a decent man, an honest man. And what happened was a bitter mistake made by people who are organizing presidential travel overseas and dealing with financial matters. Most likely, he didn't even know about the whole business to do with credit cards. But when we talk about his daughters, it is a more complicated matter. It would be interesting to find out how a modest member of the presidential administration, Tatiana Dyachenko, with a salary of 5,000 to 6,000 rubles, could spend $10,000 without asking herself where this money came from.
And Tatiana Dyachenko is not the only Yeltsin family member tarnished by scandal. Valery Okulov is married to Boris Yeltsin's other daughter, Yelena. He runs the state airline Aeroflot, subject of scandal number 3. Prosecutors in Russia and Switzerland are investigating whether profits from Aeroflot held in a Swiss bank account were stolen while Mr. Okulov was in command. He denies all the allegations, but says the welter of charges has brought anguish to his father-in-law, the president.
We are feeling terrible. Obviously, it hurts. It's hard to get through. I have no doubt that there will be answers to these absolutely fictional allegations.
From the Bank of New York to the Kremlin's renovations to the Aeroflot investigation, the whiff of scandal now touches a wide range of business and political leaders in Russia. Allegations and denials cloud the political atmosphere.
At one time in that piece, we incorrectly identified a man as the former Russian envoy to the FBI. It should have read former envoy to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.